On the 31st day of October in the year 1517, under a gray Saxony sky, a 34-year-old Augustinian monk named Martin Luther stood before the castle church of Wittenberg. In his hand, he held a document containing 95 propositions written in precise Latin ink. With a hammer that would echo through 15 centuries of Christian history, he nailed the paper to the heavy oak doors, not as an act of rebellion, but as an invitation to academic debate. The sound of iron striking wood vanished into the autumn wind, unaware that this single moment would fracture Christendom forever. The medieval world was a realm where the Catholic Church stood as the unshakable pillar of civilization, its golden crosses gleaming atop cathedral spires that pierced the heavens from Lisbon to Warsaw. Popes commanded armies, bishops ruled territories, and the faithful believed that salvation flowed through the Church's sacred gates alone. Indulgences purchased with hard-earned pennies from peasant families filled vaults in Rome, while the Basilica of St. Peter rose in marble and gold, its construction costing 12 million florins extracted from the pockets of the poor. The system was absolute, the hierarchy unchallenged, and the unity of Western Christianity had remained unbroken for over 1,000 years. But beneath the gilded surface, corruption festered like a wound refusing to heal. Johann Tetzel, a Dominican friar with a voice like thunder, traveled through German towns preaching that coins clinking in the collection box could release souls from purgatory's flames. As soon as the coin in the coffer rings, the soul from purgatory springs, he proclaimed, while 50,000 guilders flowed from Germany to Rome in the year 1517 alone. In the university town of Wittenberg, Luther read these claims with growing horror, his theological training colliding violently with the commercialized salvation on display. The tower where he meditated in silence held the seeds of a revolution that would dismantle the world he knew. What followed was not a quiet theological dispute, but a continental firestorm that consumed empires, reshaped borders, and birthed the modern world. Emperors faced excommunication, kings broke from centuries of allegiance, and millions of common people found themselves forced to choose sides in a conflict that would claim 300,000 lives over 25 years of religious warfare. The printing press, Gutenberg's invention from just 2 centuries prior, carried Luther's words across Europe at speeds unimaginable to previous generations, transforming 3,000 copies into 200,000 readers within months. All of this began with one letter, one document, one hammer strike against the doors of history. The story of how Christianity itself was split forever. On the 31st day of October, in the year 1517, the autumn air hung heavy over the town of Wittenberg in electoral Saxony. Martin Luther, a 34-year-old Augustinian monk and professor of biblical theology at the university, stood before the massive bronze doors of the castle church. In his calloused hand, he held a document written in precise Latin ink containing 95 propositions against the sale of indulgences. With a simple hammer strike against the oak, he initiated a chain reaction that would fracture Western Christianity for all time. The castle church itself was no humble chapel, but a magnificent structure funded by Frederick the Wise, Elector of Saxony, whose collection of 17,000 relics promised over 2 million years of indulgence to visitors. Its red brick facade rose 3 stories high, with twin towers framing the central entrance, and inside lay the tombs of Saxon nobility under marble slabs. The doors served as the town bulletin board where academic disputations were customarily posted, a public notice visible to all who passed along the cobblestone street. Luther did not intend revolution, but rather a scholarly debate on the theological validity of indulgence preaching. Johann Tetzel, the Dominican friar whose aggressive indulgence campaign had provoked Luther's anger, stood just 40 miles away in Jüterbog when the hammer struck. Tetzel's voice had thundered through German marketplaces for months, declaring that coins clinking in the collection box could release souls from purgatory's flames. His formula was simple and brutal. As soon as the coin in the coffer rings, the soul from purgatory springs. The Archbishop Albert of Mainz had authorized this campaign to repay a massive debt of 30,000 florins to the Fugger banking family for the papal dispensation allowing him to hold multiple bishoprics simultaneously. Within weeks, the 95 Theses appeared not as Latin academic text, but as translated German pamphlets carried by merchants along trade routes. The newly invented printing press, Johannes Gutenberg's marvel from just 2 centuries prior, in the year 1440, churned out 3,000 copies within the first month. By the year 1518, over 200,000 Germans had read Luther's words in their native tongue, transforming a local theological dispute into a continental crisis. The speed of this dissemination would have been unimaginable to any previous generation in human history. Pope Leo X, born Giovanni de' Medici on September 11, 1475, initially dismissed the disturbance as trivial. He told his cardinal advisor that this was merely a drunken German who will write differently when sober. The Medici Pope had inherited a papacy in deep financial crisis, having spent 12 million florins on the construction of St. Peter's Basilica under his predecessor, Julius II. The basilica's massive dome, designed by Bramante, dominated the Roman skyline and represented the greatest architectural undertaking since the ancient Colosseum. Indulgence revenues from Germany provided the primary funding source for this sacred project. The financial architecture behind the indulgence trade was staggering in its complexity and scale. Albert of Mainz owed 30,000 florins to the Fugger banking house, a sum equivalent to the annual income of 50,000 peasants. 50,000 additional guilders flowed from German territories to Rome in the year 1517 alone, drained from the pockets of farmers, merchants, and craftsmen. The system extracted wealth from the periphery of Christendom to fund the opulent center in Rome, where cardinals lived in palaces rivaling European monarchs. Luther's personal history shaped his fury at this commercialized salvation. His father Hans Luther, a copper miner, who accumulated 30,000 guilders through mining operations in Mansfeld, had demanded his son become a lawyer. On July 2, 1505, a lightning strike near Stotternheim terrified 22-year-old Martin into swearing entry to the Augustinian order. He spent 7 years in rigorous monastic discipline, flogging himself daily, fasting for weeks, and confessing for hours while still fearing divine judgment. His tower experience, reading Romans chapter 1 verse 17, revealed justification by faith alone and shattered his understanding of church authority. The theological core of the 95 Theses attacked the Pope's claimed power over purgatory directly. Luther argued that if Pope Julius II possessed the authority to empty purgatory for money, why did he not do so out of holy charity rather than greed? This question struck at the financial heart of the papal system, which relied on indulgence revenues for papal wars, architectural projects, and the luxurious lifestyle of the Roman clergy. The Theses circulated through university networks, merchant guilds, and printing houses with unprecedented velocity. By the winter of 1517, the 95 Theses had reached the fingers of scholars in Leipzig, Nuremberg, and Basel. The University of Leipzig, founded in 1490 with 1,200 students, became a center of theological debate where Luther's ideas were dissected in lectures. Johann Eck, a professor of theology at Leipzig, would become Luther's first major opponent, challenging him to the public disputation that would force Luther to clarify his position on papal authority. The intellectual firestorm had begun in a small Saxon town, but would soon consume all of Europe. Today, we walk through the moment that shattered Christendom, and the story of how one letter split Christianity forever. The castle church doors still stand today, though the original bronze was replaced in the 19th century with memorial plaques bearing Luther's text. Pilgrims trace the Latin words with fingers, unaware that the sound of iron striking wood on that October morning created the modern world. The schism that began in Wittenberg would eventually claim 300,000 lives over 25 years of religious warfare and birth Protestant denominations numbering in the thousands today. In the year 1500, Western Christianity stood as a unified fortress spanning from the Atlantic coast of Portugal to the Polish plains, from the Norwegian fjords to the Mediterranean islands. The Catholic Church commanded the spiritual allegiance of over 80 million souls who believed without question that salvation flowed through its sacraments alone. Bishops ruled territories larger than kingdoms. Archbishops sat in royal councils, and the Pope in Rome, wielded temporal power over the Papal States, a territory stretching 400 miles across central Italy. The church's golden crosses gleamed atop cathedral spires that pierced the heavens in every major city, from the mighty Notre Dame of Paris to the towering Cologne Cathedral still under construction. The financial architecture of the medieval church was staggering in its scale and complexity. Papal revenues in the year 1500 reached 600,000 ducats annually, equivalent to the income of a major European monarch. The Apostolic Camera, the papal treasury, maintained detailed ledgers recording income from annates, which were the first year's revenue from every bishopric that flowed directly to Rome. When a new bishop was appointed in the wealthy Diocese of Milan, 40,000 florins flowed to the Vatican. The Diocese of Cologne, equally rich, sent 35,000 florins. Even modest bishoprics contributed 5,000 to 10,000 florins each. Indulgences had become the church's most lucrative revenue stream by the early 1600s. The trade in plenary indulgences, which promised complete remission of temporal punishment for sins, generated over 200,000 ducats annually across Christendom. The Archbishop Albert of Mainz, who held 3 bishoprics simultaneously, despite canonical prohibition, collected indulgence revenues totaling 100,000 florins per year. Half of this sum went to Rome, while the other half serviced his massive debt of 30,000 florins to the Fugger banking family. The Fuggers, headquartered in Augsburg, had become the wealthiest banking dynasty in Europe with assets exceeding 2 million florins. The hierarchy maintaining this system was rigid and elaborate. At the apex sat the Pope, currently Leo X, born Giovanni de' Medici on September 11, 1475, son of Lorenzo the Magnificent. Below him ruled 23 cardinals who lived in palaces rivaling European monarchs, with Cardinal Alessandro Farnese maintaining a household of 200 servants. 70 bishops governed dioceses across Europe, each surrounded by a court of priests, deacons, and administrators. The parish clergy, numbering over 300,000, formed the base of this pyramid, serving villages where the church was often the only stone building for miles. Cathedrals themselves stood as monuments to church wealth and power. St. Peter's Basilica in Rome, under construction since 1450 under Pope Nicholas V, would ultimately cost 12 million florins to complete. Its massive dome, designed by Donato Bramante and later Michelangelo, rose 448 feet above the Vatican, dominating the Roman skyline. The interior contained over 400 statues, 150 mosaics, and marble slabs moube from ancient Rome reworked into Christian monuments. Pilgrims who visited could view the Holy Stairs, believed to be the palace stairs of Pontius Pilate, transported stone by stone from Jerusalem. The church's temporal power extended beyond spiritual matters into law, education, and governance. Canon law governed marriage, inheritance, and contracts for all faithful Christians. The church courts tried cases involving clergy, heresy, and moral offenses, operating independently of secular authority. Universities across Europe, from Bologna founded in 1088 to Paris founded in 1150, were church institutions where theology was the supreme. The University of Wittenberg, founded by Frederick the Wise in 1502, employed Martin Luther as professor of biblical theology with an annual salary of 100 florins. Religious life permeated every aspect of medieval existence. The liturgical calendar marked time with feast days, fast days, and holy days of obligation that totaled over 100 days per year. Monasteries owned over 1/3 of the cultivated land in France and England, operating as agricultural and economic powerhouses. The Benedictine monastery of Cluny, the largest in Christendom, possessed revenues of £30,000 annually and controlled over 2,000 dependent priories. Pilgrimage routes to Rome, Jerusalem, and Santiago de Compostela carried hundreds of thousands of devotees annually, each paying for lodging, food, and relics along the way. The unity of Western Christianity had remained unbroken for over 1,000 years since the coronation of Charlemagne on Christmas Day, 800 by Pope Leo III. Eastern Orthodoxy had separated in the Great Schism of 1054, but the Latin Church maintained absolute authority from the British Isles to the Hungarian plains. Heresy was rare and brutally suppressed, as the Albigensian Crusade against the Cathars in southern France demonstrated. Between 1209 and 1229, over 20,000 heretics were killed in a campaign that cost the Church £40,000 and consumed the wealthiest region in medieval France. Yet beneath the gilded surface, corruption festered like an open wound. Simony, the buying and selling of church offices, was rampant, with bishoprics auctioned to the highest bidder. Pope Alexander VI, born Rodrigo Borgia in 1031, sold over 100 ecclesiastical positions during his pontificate from 1492 to 1503, generating revenues of 100,000 ducats. Nepotism was equally widespread, with popes appointing relatives to powerful positions. Alexander VI created 7 cardinals, who were his own children, including Cesare Borgia, who became a prince of the church at age 17. The moral decay extended to the highest levels of clerical authority. Pope Julius II, who reigned from 1503 to 1513, led armies in person, wearing armor and wielding a sword as he conquered territories for the Papal States. He fathered at least 3 children before becoming a cardinal, though he maintained public chastity thereafter. His successor, Leo X, spent lavishly on hunting, opera, and art, once declaring that since God had given us the papacy, we must enjoy it. The Vatican libraries contained over 5,000 manuscripts, while the Sistine Chapel displayed Michelangelo's frescoes painted between 1508 and 1512 at a cost of 30,000 florins. The system was absolute, the hierarchy unchallenged, and the unity of Western Christianity seemed eternal. Peasants never questioned the priest's authority, nobles never challenged the bishop's jurisdiction, and kings rarely defied the pope's decrees. The possibility of schism was unthinkable, a nightmare scenario from distant history like the Great Schism of 1054 or the Western Schism from 1378 to 1417, when 3 rival popes claimed legitimacy. The Church had survived every crisis for over 15 centuries, and the year 1517 would not be different, or so everyone believed. Martin Luther was born on November 10th, 1483, in the mining town of Eisleben in the county of Mansfeld, Electoral Saxony. His father Hans Luther, born Hans Luther in 1459, was a copper miner who transformed himself into a prosperous mining entrepreneur through relentless work and shrewd business acumen. By the year 1500, Hans Luther owned 3 smelting operations and employed over 200 workers, accumulating a fortune of 30,000 guilders that placed him among the wealthy bourgeoisie of Saxony. His mother, Margaret Lindemann, born in 1459, was the daughter of a prosperous merchant family in Eisleben, who instilled in her son a strict religious devotion. The Luther family, later spelling their name Luther in the humanist tradition, lived in a substantial timber-framed house on the main street of Mansfeld, where young Martin heard the clang of hammers from the foundry windows. Hans Luther demanded absolute obedience and academic excellence from his 3 sons, beating Martin severely when he failed to recite Latin grammar correctly. The boy spent his earliest years watching furnace fires burn through the night, the orange glow illuminating the anxious faces of miners emerging from the depths with copper ore. This world of hard labor, dangerous depths, and metal transformation would shape Luther's understanding of spiritual struggle and divine judgment. In the spring of 1497, 13-year-old Martin left home to attend the Latin school in Magdeburg, where he studied for 1 year under the Brethren of the Common Life. He continued his education at the school in Eisenach from 1498 to 1501, living as a poor student who sang for food at doorways. The wooden house where Luther lived in Eisenach still stands today, its timber beams blackened by 500 years of smoke from countless hearths. In 1502, he enrolled at the University of Erfurt, the largest in Germany with over 2,000 students, where he studied the trivium of grammar, logic, and rhetoric. Luther earned his bachelor's degree on January 6, 1505, and his master's degree on January 21st, 1507, at age 23, making him one of the youngest masters in university history. His father celebrated this achievement by hosting a feast for 40 guests, announcing his intention for Martin to study law and join the imperial bureaucracy. Hans Luther had saved 5,000 guilders specifically for his son's legal education, money that would secure the family's elevation into the upper bourgeoisie. Martin enrolled in the law school at Erfurt in May 1505, purchasing Ben de Libri Legalis worth 20 guilders and attending lectures on Roman law. On July 2, 1505, 22-year-old Martin Luther was traveling back to Erfurt from Mansfeld when a violent thunderstorm erupted near the village of Stotternheim. Lightning struck the ground just feet from where he stood, throwing him to the ground in terror, while his companions remained unharmed. In that moment of mortal fear, Luther cried out to Saint Anne, the patron saint of miners, swearing that if he survived, he would become a monk. The lightning bolt that spared his life while killing a nearby farmer became the pivotal moment that would shatter Christendom forever. He kept his vow, entering the Augustinian Black Monastery at Erfurt on July 17, 1505, against his father's furious objections. The Augustinian monastery was a massive stone complex with high walls enclosing a courtyard, a church, dormitories, and a library containing 1,500 manuscripts. Luther took his novice vows on August 17, 1505, wearing the black habit that identified him as a member of the Order of St. Augustine. He subjected himself to extreme ascetic practices, fasting for weeks at a time, flogging himself daily until his back bled, and confessing his sins for hours to his superiors. Despite his rigorous discipline, Luther remained tormented by the question of whether God accepted him, waking in the night sweating with fear of divine judgment. His confessor, Johann Staupitz, the vicar general of the Augustinians, repeatedly told him that God desires mercy, not sacrifice, but Luther could not find peace. In 1512, Luther completed his Doctor of Theology degree at the University of Wittenberg, receiving the title Doctor Biblicus with an annual salary of 100 florins. He moved into the Augustinian monastery at Wittenberg, a smaller version of the Erfurt complex with red brick walls and a church dedicated to all saints. Frederick the Wise, Elector of Saxony, had founded this monastery in 1505 to house his collection of 17,000 relics, including wood from the True Cross and straw from Christ's manger. Luther's tower room in the monastery was small and cold, with a single window overlooking the monastery garden where he meditated for hours on the meaning of Romans chapter 1 verse 17. The tower experience, occurring sometime between 1515 and 1518, transformed Luther's understanding of salvation forever. While meditating on the words, "The just shall live by faith," he suddenly understood that righteousness came not from human works, but from God's grace received through faith alone. This revelation shattered his decades of spiritual torment and became the foundation of Protestant theology. Luther later described this moment as though I had found the paradise of God itself. The gates of heaven opened before my eyes. The theological breakthrough that would destroy the unity of Western Christianity began in silence and solitude, in a cold monastery tower. Luther's physical appearance matched his intense spiritual struggle. He stood 5 feet 6 inches tall, with a broad face, deep-set eyes that burned with intensity, and a voice that could thunder from the pulpit. His hands were calloused from manual labor in the monastery garden, and his beard was thick and dark, framing a mouth that spoke with absolute conviction. Contemporary portraits show him with a serious expression, his brow furrowed by years of spiritual anguish, his eyes fixed on some distant vision. He drank moderately, preferred beer to wine, and ate simple food of bread, vegetables, and occasional meat. The man who would split Christianity forever was not a reckless revolutionary, but a deeply principled scholar whose theological convictions left him no choice. Luther wrote with a quill pen on parchment sheets, his handwriting precise and deliberate, his arguments building with logical force. He spoke German with a thick Saxon accent, his sermons lasting over an hour as he unpacked biblical texts, word by word. His marriage to Katharina von Bora, a former nun who escaped her convent with 11 other women in 1523, would produce 6 children and establish the model of the Protestant pastor's family. The hammer that nailed the 95 theses to the castle church doors was the same hammer he used to build furniture for his growing family in the years that followed. In the year 1517, the indulgence trade operated as the most lucrative financial engine in medieval Christendom, extracting wealth from the poorest peasants to fund the opulent Vatican. Johann Tetzel, a Dominican friar born in Leipzig in 1665, became the face of this commercialized salvation with his booming voice and theatrical preaching style. Tetzel traveled through German towns accompanied by a scrivener who recorded every coin deposited, his wooden chest painted with the papal cross and lined with iron bars. He stood on a raised platform in the marketplace, wearing the brown habit of his order, and proclaimed that the indulgence cross was as authoritative as the cross of Christ itself. His formula became infamous throughout Germany. As soon as the coin in the coffer rings, the soul from purgatory springs. This rhyming phrase captured the essence of the transaction, reducing salvation to a simple exchange of silver for spiritual release. Tetzel claimed that the indulgence he sold was so powerful that even if someone had violated the Virgin Mary herself, they could purchase forgiveness. He promised that the indulgence would release not only the buyer, but also their deceased relatives from purgatory's flames, appealing to the deep, familial piety of medieval Christians. The psychological manipulation was deliberate and calculated, exploiting the fear of loved ones burning in the fires of purification. The financial architecture behind Tetzel's campaign was staggering in its complexity and scale. Archbishop Albert of Mainz, born on June 28, 1490, held 3 bishoprics simultaneously despite canonical prohibition against pluralism. The Diocese of Mainz alone generated 100,000 florins annually, while the Diocese of Magdeburg contributed 40,000 florins, and the bishopric of Halberstadt added another 20,000 florins. Albert owed 30,000 florins to the Fugger banking family in Augsburg, a debt incurred to purchase papal dispensation, allowing him to hold multiple sees. The indulgence revenues were structured so that half would go to Rome to fund St. Peter's Basilica, while the other half would service Albert's debt to the Fuggers. Tetzel's campaign in 1517 extracted 50,000 guilders from German territories alone, money that flowed through collection boxes in over 200 towns and villages. A peasant family earning 200 guilders per year might contribute 5 guilders to the indulgence, representing 25% of their annual income. A merchant in Nuremberg with annual profits of 5,000 guilders could be pressed to contribute 100 guilders without significant hardship. The system extracted wealth from the periphery of Christendom to fund the luxurious center in Rome, where cardinals lived in palaces rivaling European monarchs. The construction of St. Peter's Basilica provided the official justification for the indulgence campaign, though the financial reality was far more complex. Pope Julius II initiated the project in 1506, demolishing the ancient basilica built by Constantine in 1326. The new design by Donato Bramante called for a massive Greek cross plan with a dome rising 448 feet above the Vatican, costing 12 million florins to complete. Michelangelo, hired in 1546 at age 72, received a salary of 500 ducats per year to design the dome. The basilica's interior would contain over 400 statues, 150 mosaics, and marble slabs from ancient Rome reworked into Christian monuments. Pope Leo X, who reigned from 1513 to 1521, inherited this financial crisis along with the papacy. Born Giovanni de' Medici on September 11, 1475, He was the son of Lorenzo the Magnificent, ruler of Florence. Leo had spent the family fortune on art, hunting, and opera, once declaring that since God had given us the papacy, we must enjoy it. His papacy spent over 2 million florins on cultural projects, including Raphael's frescoes in the Vatican apartments, painted between 1508 and 1514. The indulgence revenues from Germany provided the primary funding source for continuing St. Peter's construction after Julius II's death. The corruption extended far beyond Tetzel's aggressive preaching. Indulgence preachers kept a percentage of the revenues they collected, creating a financial incentive for exaggeration and deception. Some preachers sold the same indulgence multiple times to the same person, claiming each purchase provided additional spiritual benefits. Bankers in Augsburg advanced money to indulgence preachers before the campaigns began, expecting repayment from future collections with interest rates of 15% annually. The entire system operated as a financial pyramid scheme, dependent on continuous expansion into new territories and new victims. The theological fraud was as egregious as the financial corruption. Tetzel claimed that purchasing an indulgence removed both the guilt and the punishment of sin, contradicting church teaching that required genuine contrition and confession. He taught that the treasury of merit, containing the infinite merits of Christ and the saints, could be accessed through monetary payment rather than through sacraments. This teaching reduced the economy of salvation to a commercial transaction where silver coins could purchase divine grace. Luther would later attack this fraud directly in Proposition 27 of his 95 Theses, declaring that when the coin rings in the chest, only greed increases in the heart. The impact on ordinary Germans was devastating. Families skipped meals to contribute to the indulgence, sold livestock to afford the collection box, and went into debt to purchase spiritual security for their deceased relatives. The 50,000 guilders extracted from Germany in 1517 represented the annual agricultural output of over 10,000 peasant families. This wealth drain from the German periphery to the Roman center created deep resentment among the German nobility, who watched their territories impoverished while Rome grew richer. The economic exploitation became as important as the theological dispute in generating support for Luther's rebellion. The indulgence trade represented the culmination of centuries of financial innovation within the church hierarchy. Annats, plenary indulgences, dispensations, and papal taxes formed a complex web of revenue streams that extracted wealth from all levels of Christian society. The system had maintained the Vatican's power for over 1,000 years, funding wars, architectural projects, and the luxurious lifestyle of the Roman clergy. But in the year 1517, this machine would encounter a man who understood its workings too well, a monk whose theological breakthrough revealed the fraud at its core. The hammer that would shatter Christendom was being forged in the silence of a monastery tower, while Tetzel's voice thundered through German marketplaces promising salvation for silver. In the autumn of 1517, Martin Luther sat in his tower room at the Augustinian monastery in Wittenberg, quill pen in hand, composing a document that would change history forever. The room was small and cold, with a single window overlooking the monastery garden where frost had already blackened the leaves. Candlelight flickered across parchment sheets stacked on his wooden desk, illuminating his precise Latin handwriting as he crafted each proposition with theological precision. Luther worked through the nights, his mind racing with arguments against the indulgence trade that had been forming since he first heard Johann Tetzel's preaching. The document that emerged contained 95 specific propositions, each numbered and carefully constructed to challenge the theological validity of indulgence preaching. Proposition 1 declared that, when our Lord and Master Jesus Christ said repent, he willed the entire life of believers to be repentance, not merely the sacrament of confession. Proposition 27 attacked Tetzel's claim directly, stating that when the coin rings in the chest, only greed increases in the heart. Proposition 62 asserted that the true treasure of the Church is the most holy gospel of the glory and grace of God, not a network of monetary transactions. Each proposition built upon the last, creating a logical argument that dismantled the indulgence system from its theological foundations. Luther's theological education at the University of Erfurt and his doctoral work at Wittenberg informed every line of the text. He had studied the Church Fathers, particularly Augustine of Hippo, whose writings on grace and predestination shaped his understanding of salvation. His readings of Paul's epistles, especially Romans chapter 1 verse 17, revealed the doctrine of justification by faith alone. The university library contained over 1,500 manuscripts, including commentaries by Thomas Aquinas, Duns Scotus, and William of Ockham that Luther had studied intensively. His arguments against indulgences drew upon this scholastic tradition while subverting its authority to challenge papal power. The political calculations behind posting the theses were as important as the theological arguments. Luther intended to invite academic debate, not to spark revolution, and followed the custom of posting disputation notices on church doors. The castle church doors served as Wittenberg's bulletin board, visible to all who passed along the cobblestone street to the marketplace. Frederick the Wise, Elector of Saxony, had founded the university in 1502 to establish Saxony as a center of learning, and Luther expected his arguments to be taken seriously by fellow scholars. He sent a copy of the theses to Archbishop Albert of Mainz on October 31st, 1517, accompanied by a letter requesting correction if his arguments were flawed. The letter to Albert was written in respectful academic tone, addressing the Archbishop as Most Reverend Father in Christ and Lord. Luther wrote that he could not remain silent while indulgence preachers deceived the faithful with false promises of salvation. He requested that Albert either correct his errors or allow him to defend his theses in public disputation. The letter included phrases showing deference to ecclesiastical authority, calling himself an unworthy monk and servant of the Church. Luther did not yet understand that he was challenging a system that would never accept academic criticism from a low-ranking monk. The timing of the posting was deliberate and significant. October 31st, 1517, was the eve of All Saints' Day, the most important feast day in Frederick the Wise's calendar. On November 1st, thousands of pilgrims would visit the castle church to view the elector's collection of 17,000 relics, including wood from the true cross that promised 200,000 years of indulgence. The crowds would ensure maximum visibility for Luther's theses, exposing his arguments to scholars, nobles, and common peasants alike. The contrast between Luther's 95 propositions and Frederick's relic collection would be stark and unavoidable. The composition process took approximately 3 weeks, from early October to October 31st, 1517. Luther drafted the theses in Latin, the language of scholarship, knowing they would first reach university networks before translation into German. He revised each proposition multiple times, polishing the arguments and ensuring theological precision. His friend Andreas Bodenstein from Karlstadt, a professor at Wittenberg, reviewed the draft and encouraged Luther to proceed with posting. The monastery scribe copied the final text onto 4 sheets of parchment, each measuring 18 inches by 12 inches, using black ink that would remain legible for years. The theological core of the 95 Theses attacked the Pope's claimed power over purgatory directly and systematically. Luther argued that if Pope Julius II possessed the authority to empty purgatory for money, why did he not do so out of holy charity rather than greed? This question struck at the financial heart of the papal system, which relied on indulgence revenues for papal wars, architectural projects, and the luxurious lifestyle of the Roman clergy. Propositions 28 through 40 argued that papal indulgences could not remove even the least of venial sins regarding guilt, much less the punishment of purgatory. Proposition 58 claimed that the treasures of indulgences are inadequate when compared with the grace of God and the piety of the cross. Luther's arguments extended beyond indulgences to challenge the entire theology of merit and works righteousness. Proposition 70 declared that a Christian is perfectly free from all laws, bound by no human commandment when it contradicts God's will. Proposition 81 warned that the arrogance of preachers who claim the indulgence is the greatest grace makes the common people hate even legitimate preaching. Proposition 86 asked why the Pope, whose wealth today exceeds that of the richest Crassus, does not build just one basilica of St. Peter with his own money, rather than taking it from poor believers. Each proposition chipped away at the theological and financial foundations of the medieval church. The night before posting, Luther prayed in the monastery church, the candlelight illuminating the wooden crucifix above the altar. He knew he was risking excommunication, imprisonment, or even death for challenging church authority, yet he felt compelled by conscience to speak truth. His tower experience, reading Romans chapter 1 verse 17, had revealed justification by faith alone and shattered his understanding of church authority. The theological breakthrough that began in silence and solitude would now be announced to the world in 95 precise propositions. The hammer strike against the castle church doors would echo through 15 centuries of Christian history, splitting Christendom forever. In the winter of 1517, the 95 Theses existed only as 4 sheets of parchment nailed to the castle church doors in Wittenberg. Within weeks, they would transform from a local academic notice into a continental firestorm, carried by merchants along trade routes from the Baltic to the Alps. The engine of this transformation was Johannes Gutenberg's printing press, invented in Mainz in the year 1440, just 73 years before Luther's action. This technology, unknown to any previous generation in human history, would carry Luther's words across Europe at speeds that would have seemed miraculous to the medieval mind. A student from Wittenberg copied the Latin text of the Theses and sent it to a printer in Leipzig, where the first pamphlet was produced within days of the posting. The Leipzig edition contained all 95 propositions in Latin, printed on cheap paper with crude type that smudged in the rain. The printer, unknown by name, produced 3,000 copies at a cost of 2 guilders per thousand, selling them for half a penny each to make a profit of 50%. Within 2 weeks, these pamphlets reached the universities of Erfurt, Cologne, and Basel, where scholars debated Luther's arguments in lecture halls and taverns. The speed of this dissemination would ignite a revolution that no single person could have controlled. By Christmas of 1517, the Theses had been translated into German and printed in Nuremberg by Johann Schott, a printer who would become Luther's most important publisher. The German translation made Luther's arguments accessible to merchants, artisans, and educated peasants who could not read Latin. The pamphlet sold for 1 penny, affordable to a craftsman earning 3 pennies per day, and over 10,000 copies were sold within the first month. The text filled 4 pages with type that was larger and clearer than the Latin edition, making it readable to anyone with basic literacy. The medium became the message, as the printing press itself demonstrated that church authority could be challenged and disseminated without clerical approval. By the year 1518, over 200,000 Germans had read Luther's words in their native tongue, transforming a local theological dispute into a continental crisis. The printing houses of Germany churned out Luther's writings at unprecedented rates, with over 100,000 pamphlets produced in the first year alone. The city of Wittenberg, with a population of only 2,000, became the publishing capital of Europe, its printers working day and night to meet demand. Andreas von Karlstadt, Luther's colleague at the university, wrote 15 pamphlets defending the Theses, while Johann Eck, his opponent from Leipzig, published 20 counter-arguments. The battle of words was fought with ink rather than swords, but the stakes were equally high. The financial impact on the printing industry was staggering. Printers in Augsburg, Basel, and Strasbourg invested over 50,000 florins in new presses to meet the demand for Reformation literature. A single printing press required an investment of 500 florins for equipment, plus 200 florins per year for paper, ink, and labor. The most successful printers became wealthy, with Johann Froben of Basel accumulating assets of 100,000 florins by 1520. The Reformation created a new economic class of printers, authors, and distributors who profited from the religious upheaval. forming a powerful financial interest in its continuation. The content of the printed materials expanded beyond the 95 theses to include sermons, letters, and theological treatises. Luther's sermon on indulgences and grace, published in German in March 1518, sold 20,000 copies in 3 weeks. His address to the Christian nobility of the German nation, printed in August 1520, sold over 40,000 copies and called for secular rulers to reform the church. The pamphlets were short, typically 8 to 16 pages, priced affordably, and written in clear German that ordinary people could understand. The printing press democratized theological debate, removing the monopoly that clergy had held over religious interpretation for over 1,000 years. The visual impact of printed materials was as important as the textual content. Woodcut illustrations accompanied many pamphlets, depicting Luther as an angel with a sword, battling the papal beast with 7 heads. These images conveyed the message to those who could not read, spreading Reformation ideas through visual culture. The most famous woodcut showed Luther standing before the imperial diet with a beam of light from heaven illuminating his face, while Pope Leo X appeared as the Antichrist in the background. Artists like Lucas Cranach the Elder, who lived in Wittenberg and became Luther's friend, produced over 100 woodcuts supporting the Reformation, earning income of 5,000 florins annually from book illustrations. The response from Rome was slow and inadequate, reflecting the papacy's underestimation of the printing press's power. Cardinal Sylvester Prierius, the master of the Sacred Palace, wrote a response to Luther in December 1518, but it was printed in only 500 copies and distributed to a handful of scholars. The papal bull Ex Surge Domini, issued on June 15, 1520, threatened excommunication, but was printed in only 1,000 copies and arrived in Germany months late. By the time Rome understood the threat, over 200,000 people had already read Luther's arguments, and the movement had developed its own momentum that no papal decree could stop. The printing press transformed Luther from a local professor into a continental figure within months. His portrait appeared on pamphlet title pages, showing his face with the Augustinian habit, the quill pen in his hand, and the Bible open before him. Merchants carried his writings from city to city, selling them in marketplaces alongside cloth and spices. The speed of information flow created a new public opinion that existed independently of church or state authority, a phenomenon unknown in previous centuries. The Reformation became the first media revolution in human history, demonstrating that control of information meant control of power. Today, over 500 years later, the original pamphlets survive in libraries from London to Vienna, their pages yellowed, but the type still legible. Scholars can trace the exact spread of Luther's ideas by examining the dates and locations of printing, mapping the revolution as it spread from Wittenberg to every corner of Europe. The hammer that nailed the theses to the church doors was simple iron, but the printing press was the weapon that made the revolution unstoppable. The 60,000 florins invested in German printing presses between 1518 and 1525 created a new information economy that would ultimately destroy the medieval church's monopoly on truth. In the winter of 1517, Pope Leo X sat in the Vatican Palace, surrounded by Raphael's frescoes and the art collection of the Medici family, dismissive of news from distant Germany. Cardinal Girolamo Aleandro, a Dutch humanist who had encountered Luther's theses in Wittenberg, reported to the Pope that a monk was challenging papal authority over indulgences. Leo X, born Giovanni de' Medici on September 11, 1475, told his advisory circle that this was merely a drunken German who will write differently when sober. The Pope had faced heresy before, including the fiery prophet Savonarola, who was executed in Florence in 1498, and he believed this dispute would fade like previous controversies. The initial papal response was characterized by ignorance and underestimation of the threat. Cardinal Sylvester Prierius, the master of the Sacred Palace and chief theologian of the Roman Inquisition, wrote a treatise titled Dialogue Against the Presumptuous Theses of Martin Luther in December 1518. Prierius argued that the Pope was infallible, and that to contradict the Church was to contradict God himself. But his treatise was printed in only 500 copies and distributed to a handful of scholars in Rome. The text was written in dense Latin that ordinary people could not read, and it offered no understanding of the theological arguments that had captivated Germany. Rome still viewed the dispute as an academic disagreement rather than a revolutionary movement. By the spring of 1518, the reality of the situation became impossible to ignore. Over 200,000 Germans had read Luther's words, and the movement had spread to universities in Leipzig, Basel, and Cologne. Cardinal Thomas de Vio, known as Cajetan, a Dominican theologian who had served as Master General of his order from 1508, was sent to Germany to confront Luther. Cajetan met Luther at the Diet of Augsburg in October 1518, demanding that he recant his errors regarding indulgences and papal authority. Luther, wearing his simple Augustinian habit, refused to recant unless convinced by Scripture, arguing that Pope Innocent III had contradicted Pope Gregoriano in their teachings on indulgences. The confrontation at Augsburg lasted 3 days, from October 12th to October 14th, 1518, in a cold stone hall within the episcopal palace. Cajetan, a man of 62 years with a sharp face and intense eyes, pressed Luther to submit to papal authority without conditions. Luther, 35 years old and of medium height, stood firm, declaring that his conscience was captive to the word of God alone. The meeting ended without resolution, with Cajetan requesting that Frederick the Wise arrest Luther and send him to Rome. Frederick refused, protecting his university professor and recognizing the political value of Luther's challenge to papal power. The escalation continued through 1519, with Rome issuing increasingly severe demands. Johann Eck, a professor of theology at the University of Leipzig, challenged Luther to a public disputation scheduled for June 27 to July 15, 1519. The debate took place in the Pleissenburg Castle in Leipzig, a massive stone fortress with high walls and a great hall that seated 2,000 spectators. Eck argued that the Pope held supreme authority over the Church by divine right, citing the papal decrees of the past 400 years. Luther, for the first time publicly, denied papal infallibility, declaring that the Council of Constance in 1414 had erred in condemning Jan Hus. This statement marked the point of no return, as Luther now challenged the authority of ecumenical councils, not just the Pope. The papal bull Exsurge Domine was issued on June 15, 1520, after nearly 2 years of deliberation. The bull, written in Latin by Cardinal Alessandro Farnese, who would later become Pope Paolo III, condemned 41 propositions from Luther's writings and threatened excommunication if he did not recant within 60 days. The text declared that Luther was a furious wolf, ravaging the Church of Christ, requiring immediate and decisive action. The bull was printed in 1,000 copies and sent to bishops throughout Germany, but it arrived months late and was met with open defiance. The 60-day deadline expired on August 14, 1520, without Luther's recantation. On December 10, 1520, Luther publicly burned the papal bull Exsurge Domine in front of the Elster Gate of Wittenberg. The scene was carefully staged, with Luther dressed in his Augustinian habit, surrounded by students and professors from the university. He threw the bull into a bonfire along with books of canon law, declaring that the Pope's laws deserved to be burned even more than the papal decree itself. The fire consumed the document in minutes, the flames illuminating the winter faces of the crowd that gathered to witness the symbolic rejection of papal authority. Luther's action was a declaration of war, an act that made reconciliation impossible and ensured that the schism would be permanent. The final excommunication came on January 3, 1521, with the bull Decet Romanum Pontificum issued by Leo X. The document declared Luther an excommunicated heretic, cutting him off from the sacraments and the community of the faithful. All Christians were forbidden to harbor, support, or correspond with Luther under penalty of excommunication themselves. The bull was printed in 1,000 copies and distributed throughout Christendom. But by this time, over 200,000 Germans had already embraced Luther's teachings. The excommunication that should have destroyed Luther instead made him a martyr and strengthened the movement that would become the Protestant Reformation. The timeline from dismissal to excommunication spanned exactly 3 years and 2 months. From the winter of 1517 to January 1521, Rome's initial ignorance gave way to panic, then to judicial condemnation, and finally to excommunication that came far too late. The 60,000 florins spent on papal diplomatic efforts and the printing of bulls failed to stop a movement powered by the printing press and fueled by genuine theological conviction. The hammer that nailed the theses to the church doors had proven more powerful than all the bulls of Rome, and the schism that began with 95 propositions would split Christianity forever. On January 28, 1521, Emperor Charles Quinto, born on February 24, 1506, convened the imperial diet at the city of Worms on the Rhine River. The young emperor, only 19 years old, had been elected king of the Romans on June 28, 1519, after paying the Fugger banking family 852,000 florins in bribes to the 7 prince-electors. The Diet of Worms was the first imperial assembly under Charles Quinto's reign, and it would determine the fate of Martin Luther and the future of the Holy Roman Empire. The city of Worms, with a population of 5,000, featured half-timbered houses lining the cobblestone streets and the massive Romanesque cathedral constructed in 1018. Luther arrived in Worms on April 6, 1521, riding in a wagon drawn by 2 horses, accompanied by 12 men, including his friend Philip Melanchthon. The journey from Wittenberg covered 200 miles through winter mud, taking 11 days in bitter cold that froze the wheels at night. Crowds gathered along the road, shouting encouragement and throwing flowers into the wagon as Luther passed through towns and villages. The movement that began with 95 propositions now commanded the loyalty of hundreds of thousands across Germany, and Luther traveled as a celebrity rather than a condemned heretic. The wagon itself was simple, its wooden frame weathered, its canvas cover torn by branches, but it carried the most dangerous man in Christendom. The imperial diet convened in the bishop's palace, a massive stone building with high walls and a great hall that seated 3,000 spectators. Present were 2 prince-electors, 7 dukes, 16 counts, and representatives from over 100 imperial cities, all gathered to witness the confrontation. Frederick the Wise, Elector of Saxony, ensured Luther's safety by pressing for legal protections, though he remained Catholic and did not yet embrace Luther's theology. The financial stakes were enormous, as the empire's fragmentation into religious factions would undermine Charles Quinto's authority and the Fugger banking family's investments in the papal indulgence trade. On April 18, 1521, Martin Luther stood before the Diet in the Great Hall, wearing his Augustinian habit that had become the uniform of the Reformation. Johann Eck, the imperial vicar of the Archbishop of Trier, stood before him with a table displaying 20 books and pamphlets authored by Luther. Eck asked whether Luther would recant the errors contained in these writings, reading the titles aloud to the assembled princes and dignitaries. Luther requested time to consider, and the Diet adjourned for one evening, allowing him to pray and prepare his response in the lodgings provided by Frederick the Wise. The following day, April 18th, Luther returned to the Diet and delivered his famous declaration that would echo through 500 years of history. He acknowledged some of his writings as theological arguments that should be judged on merit, but refused to recant unless convinced by Scripture or plain reason. Luther declared that his conscience was captive to the Word of God, and to act against conscience was neither safe nor right. Then came the words that would define the Reformation. "Here I stand. I can do no other. God help me. Amen." The hall fell silent as the weight of Luther's defiance settled over the assembled princes, who understood that this moment would change the empire forever. The emperor's response was immediate and severe. Charles Quinto, speaking through his counselor Mercurino Gattinara, declared that a single monk in error could not stand against the faith of all Christian peoples for over 1,000 years. On May 8th, 1521, the Edict of Worms was issued, declaring Luther an outlaw and heretic. The edict prohibited anyone from harboring, feeding, or supporting Luther under penalty of confiscation of property and loss of noble status. Luther's writings were to be burned, and anyone found possessing them would be arrested and sent to the emperor. The edict was printed in 1,000 copies and distributed throughout the empire, but enforcement was impossible in territories where princes supported the Reformation. The legal safeguards that Frederick the Wise had secured for Luther proved inadequate against imperial authority. Luther was placed under the imperial ban, meaning he could be killed with impunity by anyone who found him, and his property could be seized without legal recourse. The journey back to Wittenberg was dangerous, with assassins hired by Catholic princes waiting along the route to ambush the outlawed monk. Frederick the Wise arranged a secret rescue, staging a kidnapping on May 4th, 1521, as Luther rode through the forest near Wartburg Castle. 5 armed men in masks seized the wagon, dragging Luther away while his companions screamed in panic. The financial cost of the diet was staggering, with over 100,000 florins spent on the assembly's logistics, security, and the emperor's entourage. The Fugger banking family advanced 50,000 florins to fund Charles Quinto's imperial agenda, expecting repayment through enforcement of the edict and continuation of the indulgence trade. The papal nuncio Jerome Aleander reported to Rome that the emperor had fulfilled all papal expectations. But the reality was far different. The edict could not be enforced in Saxony, Hesse, and over 100 other territories where local princes protected Luther and his followers. The collapse of the Edict of Worms began within months of its issuance. By the autumn of 1521, over 50 cities in Germany had publicly embraced Luther's teachings, burning papal bulls and replacing Catholic priests with Protestant preachers. The financial machinery of the indulgence trade had collapsed, with revenues from Germany dropping from 50,000 guilders in 1517 to less than 5,000 guilders in 1522. The 300,000 florins that had flowed annually from German territories to Rome came to a sudden halt, devastating the papal budget and the construction of St. Peter's Basilica. Today, the bishop's palace in Worms still stands, its stone walls bearing the marks of 500 years of weather and war. The great hall where Luther stood before the emperor has been preserved as a museum, with a bronze statue of Luther erected in 1868 at the center of the city. The statue shows Luther with his quill pen in one hand and the Bible in the other, his face turned toward heaven as if hearing the word of God. The words he spoke on April 18th, 1521, transformed a theological dispute into a revolution that would split Christianity forever, and no edict, no ban, no papal bull could ever reverse it. On May 4th, 1521, 5 armed men in masks seized Martin Luther from his wagon in the forest near Eisenach. The staged kidnapping carried the outlawed monk to Wartburg Castle, a massive stone fortress perched 700 feet above the town of Eisenach in Thuringia. The castle, built in 1067 by Louis El Saltador, Count of Thuringia, featured thick walls 50 feet high, a central tower rising 100 feet, and a chapel with vaulted ceilings painted in blue and gold. Frederick the Wise had arranged this secret refuge, understanding that Luther's life depended on remaining hidden from the assassins waiting along the roads. Luther's quarters in the castle were in the tower room, a small chamber with a single narrow window overlooking the Thuringian forest. The room measured 12 feet by 15 feet, with stone walls that stayed cold even in summer, and a wooden bed that creaked under his weight. He took the pseudonym Junker Jörg, or Knight George, wearing a knight's cloak and growing a beard and mustache to disguise his identity as an Augustinian monk. For 11 months, from May 1521 to March 1522, Luther lived in isolation, forbidden to leave the castle under penalty of death. The silence of the tower was broken only by the sound of his quill pen scratching across parchment and the wind howling through the forest below. Despite the isolation, Luther's productivity was staggering. He began translating the New Testament from Greek into German on September 18, 1521, using Erasmus's Greek text published in 1516. The translation task required him to work 12 hours per day, sitting at a wooden desk that still survives in the Castle Museum today. Luther wrote to his friend Philippe Melanchthon that the German language was harsh and unrefined, requiring him to search the streets and markets for words that ordinary people understood. He would knock on the doors of common folk asking how they spoke, collecting vocabulary that would make his translation accessible to merchants, artisans, and peasants. The New Testament was completed in just 11 weeks, finished on December 27, 1521, a feat of scholarly endurance unprecedented in the history of translation. The manuscript contained 900 pages written in Luther's precise hand, with corrections and annotations in the margins showing his struggle with Greek idioms. Luther translated Romans chapter 1 verse 17 as "the righteous shall live by faith," crystallizing his theological breakthrough into German prose that would shape the language itself. The translation captured the rhythm of spoken German, using phrases like help and aid instead of the Latin-style assistance, and God's grace instead of divine favor. The printing and publication of Luther's New Testament transformed the Reformation from a theological movement into a cultural revolution. The first edition was printed in September 1522 by Melchior Lotter the Younger in Wittenberg, producing 3,000 copies at a cost of 8 guilders per copy. The price was prohibitive for most peasants, but affordable to merchants earning 50 guilders per year, and the entire edition sold out within 3 months. The September Testament, as it became known, featured woodcut illustrations by Lucas Cranach the Elder, including the dramatic image of Luther as the angel with a sword from the Book of Revelation. The type was large and clear, the paper sturdy, and the binding durable, making it a book that could survive decades of use. The linguistic impact of Luther's translation extended far beyond religious texts. Before Luther, German existed as dozens of dialects that people from different regions could not understand. Luther's translation created a standardized High German based on the Saxon Chancery language, combined with vocabulary from across the German-speaking world. The New Testament was read in homes from the Rhine to the Oder, from the Baltic to the Alps, creating a shared language that unified German culture. The phrase Urengel, meaning original angel, and Verdammnis, meaning damnation, entered the German language through Luther's translation and remain in use today. The linguistic revolution created by this single book lasted 500 years and continues to shape how over 100 million people speak. The financial impact on the printing industry was enormous, with over 100,000 copies of Luther's New Testament sold between 1522 and 1534. The profit margin for printers was 50%, with each copy selling for 8 guilders, while costing only 4 guilders to produce. The Wittenberg printers, led by Hans Luft, became wealthy, accumulating assets of 50,000 florins by 1530. The Reformation created an entire publishing industry, with over 200 printers in Germany producing Bibles, pamphlets, and catechisms. The economic power of this industry provided financial support for the Reformation that no papal bull could overcome. Luther's translation work was not without controversy and criticism. Catholic scholars attacked his translation of Romans chapter 3 verse 28, where he added the word alone to the phrase justified by faith alone. The phrase faith alone appeared nowhere in the original Greek text, but Luther argued it was necessary to convey Paul's meaning in German. He defended this addition in his Letters on Translation, written in 1530, declaring that the German people must understand the gospel clearly even if it required adding words. This controversy highlighted the fundamental difference between Catholic and Protestant approaches to Scripture, with Catholics insisting on the Latin Vulgate and Protestants demanding vernacular translations. The castle itself became a symbol of the Reformation, protected by Frederick the Wise despite his Catholic faith. The tower room where Luther worked was preserved after his death, with the wooden desk, the bed, and the narrow window remaining intact for 500 years. Pilgrims climbed the 400 steps to the tower chamber, touching the stone walls where Luther had translated the New Testament in isolation. The castle survived the 30 Years' War, the Napoleonic invasion, and 2 world wars, standing today as a UNESCO World Heritage Site, visited by 100,000 people annually. In March 1522, after 11 months of isolation, Luther secretly left Wartburg Castle and returned to Wittenberg. The journey was dangerous, with the imperial ban still in effect and assassins still hunting for him. But he could not remain in hiding while the Reformation faced crisis. His German New Testament had been published, his translation had shaped the German language, and his work in the tower had created the foundation for Protestant theology. The 11 months in Wartburg Castle produced the most influential book translation since the Latin Vulgate, and the 900 pages of Luther's New Testament would be read by millions, transforming Christianity forever. While Luther's movement consumed Germany, the Reformation spread across Europe with unstoppable momentum, carried by printers, preachers, and exiled scholars. In the Swiss city of Zurich, Huldrych Zwingli, born on January 1st, 1484, began preaching reform in 1519, just 2 years after Luther's 95 Theses. Zwingli was a humanist scholar who had studied at the University of Vienna and the University of Basel, earning his master's degree in 1506 with a fortune of 500 guilders inherited from his father, a wealthy village mayor. The Great Minster Church in Zurich, where Zwingli preached, was a Gothic structure begun in 1421, with twin towers rising 200 feet above the Limmat River. Zwingli's theological arguments differed from Luther's in important ways, particularly regarding the Eucharist. While Luther insisted on the real presence of Christ in the bread and wine, Zwingli declared that the Eucharist was merely a symbolic memorial. This disagreement led to the Marburg Colloquy on October 1st to October 4th, 1529, where Luther and Zwingli met in the castle of Landgrave Philip of Hesse. The castle was a massive stone fortress with thick walls and a great hall that seated 500 people, where the two reformers debated for 3 days without reaching agreement. Luther wrote the words, "This is my body on the table," in chalk, refusing to compromise on the literal meaning, while Zwingli maintained his symbolic interpretation. The failure to unite Germany and Switzerland into a single Protestant movement weakened the Reformation and allowed Catholic powers to exploit the division. In France, John Calvin, born Jacques Calvin on July 10, 1509, in the town of Noyon, developed a more systematic theology that would become the foundation for Reformed Christianity. Calvin's father, Gérard Calvin, was a lawyer who accumulated 10,000 livres through his legal practice, enabling John to study at the University of Paris, the University of Orléans, and the University of Bourges. Calvin converted to Protestantism in 1533, forcing him to flee Paris on October 23, 1535, after publishing a defense of Protestants before the king. He settled in Basel, Switzerland, where he published the Institute of Christian Religion in 1536 at age 27. The first edition, containing only 6 chapters, sold for 3 florins. The Institute of Christian Religion was expanded through 5 editions, with the final edition in 1559 containing 80 chapters and over 300,000 words. Calvin's theology emphasized the sovereignty of God, the predestination of the elect, and the absolute authority of Scripture. His doctrine of predestination declared that God had chosen who would be saved and who would be damned before the foundation of the world, a teaching that both comforted and terrified believers. The Institute was translated into French in 1541, into English in 1561, and into over 20 languages by 1600, with over 1 million copies printed in the first century. The financial impact was enormous, with the Institute generating 50,000 florins in royalties for Calvin's heirs, and establishing Basel as a center of Protestant publishing. Calvin settled in Geneva in 1536, transforming the city into the Protestant capital of Europe. Geneva, with a population of 10,000, was a walled city surrounded by stone fortifications built in 1490, with narrow streets and tall houses lining the Rhone River. Calvin established a theocratic government where the consistory, composed of 12 elders and 4 pastors, enforced moral discipline with unprecedented rigor. Adultery was punished by death, as in the case of Pietro Bochet, who was executed on August 23, 1545, and dancing, gambling, and playing cards were forbidden under penalty of imprisonment. The Geneva Academy, founded in 1559, educated over 1,000 students who became pastors and preachers throughout Europe, spreading Calvin's theology to France, Scotland, the Netherlands, and England. In England, the Reformation took a different path, driven not by theology but by royal politics and the marital troubles of King Henry VIII. Henry VIII, born on June 28, 1491, had married Catherine of Aragon on June 11, 1509, hoping for a male heir who would secure the Tudor dynasty. After 24 years of marriage and only one surviving daughter, Mary, Henry sought an annulment from Pope Clement VII, who refused under pressure from Catherine's nephew, Emperor Charles Quinto. The king's great matter, as it became known, dragged on for 6 years from 1527 to 1533, during which Henry secretly married Anne Boleyn on January 25, 1533. The Act of Supremacy, passed by Parliament on November 3, 1534, declared Henry VIII the supreme head of the Church of England, breaking England's allegiance to Rome. The act required all clergy and officials to swear an oath acknowledging the king's supremacy, punishable by treason for refusal. Thomas More, who had served as Lord Chancellor from 1529 to 1532, refused the oath and was executed on July 6, 1535, at age 57. John Fisher, Bishop of Rochester, was executed on June 22, 1535, at age 82, becoming the only English bishop to die for loyalty to Rome. The financial consequences were staggering, as Henry dissolved the monasteries between 1536 and 1540, seizing assets worth £1 million that represented 25% of England's cultivated land. The dissolution of the monasteries transferred wealth from the church to the crown and the nobility who purchased monastery lands. The largest monastery, Glastonbury Abbey, possessed revenues of £3,000 annually and was dissolved on November 19, 1539, with its abbot, Richard Whiting, hanged on Glastonbury Tor. The monastery of Westminster, with revenues of £2,000, was dissolved on December 3, 1539. Its churches and lands sold for £200,000 to pay for Henry's wars with France. The CID treasury received over £1 million from the dissolution, funding the construction of 12 coastal fortifications costing £100,000 each and the war with France, that cost £2 million between 1544 and 1546. The spread of the Reformation created a fragmented Christendom, where over 100 million people were divided into Catholic, Lutheran, Reformed, and Anglican churches. The printing press carried Protestant literature across borders, with over 500,000 pamphlets printed in German, French, English, and Dutch between 1520 and 1540. The religious divisions would explode into 300,000 deaths over 25 years of warfare, beginning with the Peasants' War in 1525 and culminating in the 30 Years' War from 1518 to 1648. The schism that began with Luther's 95 Theses had transformed the entire continent, splitting Christianity forever. The religious divisions that began in Wittenberg exploded into open warfare in 1525, when over 300,000 German peasants rose in revolt against feudal oppression. The Peasants' War, as it became known, was inspired by Luther's teachings on Christian freedom, but turned against him when he condemned the rebellion in his tract against the murdering hordes of peasants. Luther wrote that peasants should be stabbed, strangled, and slaughtered like mad dogs, and over 100,000 peasants were killed in the brutal suppression that followed. The war cost the German territories 2 million florins in property damage, destroyed over 2,000 castles and monasteries, and left the countryside devastated by armies that burned crops and slaughtered livestock. The suppression of the Peasants' War strengthened the nobility, but weakened Luther's popular support, as many peasants felt betrayed by the reformer who had promised spiritual freedom. The Prince Bishop of Würzburg, who commanded an army of 10,000 men, killed over 30,000 peasants in the Battle of Frankenhausen on May 15, 1525. The battlefield was a plain outside the town where the peasants had constructed earthworks, but their crude weapons of scythes and pitchforks could not withstand the cavalry charges of the nobles. The heads of 12 peasant leaders were cut off and displayed on pikes around Würzburg as a warning to future rebels. The religious wars that followed spanned 25 years from 1524 to 1555, claiming 300,000 lives across the Holy Roman Empire. The Schmalkaldic War, fought between 1546 and 1547, pitted Emperor Charles Quinto against the Schmalkaldic League, an alliance of Lutheran princes led by John Frederick, Elector of Saxony, and Philip, Landgrave of Hesse. The Battle of Mühlberg on April 24, 1547, saw Charles Quinto's army of 25,000 men defeat the Schmalkaldic forces of 16,000. John Frederick was captured and sentenced to death, commuted to life imprisonment in exchange for ceding the electorate to Maurice of Saxony, who had betrayed his cousin for political advantage. The financial cost of the Schmalkaldic War was staggering, with over 5 million florins spent on armies, fortifications, and mercenaries. The Fugger banking family advanced 2 million florins to Charles Quinto, expecting repayment through confiscated Protestant properties and restoration of Catholic tithe revenues. The war devastated the German economy, with trade routes blocked, markets closed, and agricultural production falling by 50% in the worst affected regions. The city of Magdeburg, which resisted imperial forces for 2 years, was besieged from November 1550 to May 9, 1551, when the city walls were breached and over 10,000 civilians were killed in the sack that lasted 3 days. The failure of military solutions led to negotiations that produced the Peace of Augsburg, signed on September 25, 1555, in the imperial city of Augsburg. The treaty established the principle of cuius regio, eius religio, meaning whose realm, his religion, allowing each prince to choose either Lutheranism or Catholicism for his territory. The peace recognized only two faiths, Lutheranism and Catholicism, excluding Calvinism and other Protestant groups that would continue to face persecution. Over 100,000 Catholics and Protestants migrated across borders in the following decade, seeking territories where their faith was permitted, creating a demographic shift that reshaped the religious map of Germany. The financial terms of the peace included the Reservation Ecclesiasticum, which declared that any Catholic bishop who converted to Protestantism would lose his territory and income. This provision was intended to prevent the secularization of church lands, but over 20 bishoprics were lost to Protestantism between 1555 and 1600. The treaty also established the Declaratorium, which allowed Protestant subjects who could not accept their prince's religion to emigrate without losing their property. This clause was used by over 50,000 Catholics and Protestants to relocate to territories where their faith was established, creating a peaceful migration that cost the empire 300,000 florins in lost tax revenues. The enforcement of the Peace of Augsburg was left to the Imperial Diet, which met annually in Augsburg to resolve disputes between Catholic and Protestant territories. The Diet included 2 prince-electors, 7 dukes, 12 counts, and representatives from over 100 imperial cities, debating for weeks over church properties, tithes, and religious rights. The Imperial Chamber Court, established in 1578, heard over 500 cases of religious conflict between 1580 and 1600, with judgments enforced inconsistently across the empire. The legal machinery of the peace was slow and costly, with each case costing an average of 500 florins in legal fees and bribes. The peace did not bring lasting peace, as tensions continued to build over the following decades. The Counter-Reformation, launched by the Council of Trent from 1545 to 1563, renewed Catholic efforts to reclaim Protestant territories. The Society of Jesus, founded by Ignatius of Loyola in 1540, established over 100 colleges across Germany, educating 5,000 students who became Jesuit priests and Jesuit confessors to Catholic princes. The Jesuits won back over 1 million Catholics in Bavaria, Austria, and the Rhineland between 1560 and 1600, reversing the Protestant advance in southern Germany. The final breakdown of the peace came in 1618, when the Bohemian revolt against Catholic Habsburg rule triggered the 30 Years' War. The war would claim 8 million lives, devastate over 60% of German territories, and cost the empire 100 million florins in property damage and military expenditures. The Peace of Augsburg had bought only 25 years of relative peace, and the schism that began with Luther's 95 Theses would continue to tear Europe apart for another century. The 300,000 deaths between 1524 and 1555 were only the beginning of the bloodletting that would follow. Today, the Peace of Augsburg is remembered as the first legal recognition of religious pluralism in Western Christianity, but its cost was measured in hundreds of thousands of lives. The Cathedral of Augsburg, where the treaty was signed, still stands with its Romanesque tower rising 200 feet above the city, its stone walls bearing the scars of 500 years of war and peace. The treaty room has been preserved as a museum, with the original signed document displayed in a glass case under guards who watch over the parchment that temporarily stopped the bloodshed. The words, cuius regio, eius religio, echo through the centuries as the principle that made religious war legal and peace temporary, the foundation for the modern concept of state sovereignty over religion. On February 18, 1546, Martin Luther died in his birthplace of Eisleben, the same town where he was born on November 10, 1483. He was 62 years old, buried in the castle church of Wittenberg, under the pulpit where he had preached for over 25 years. The man who had nailed 95 propositions to church doors now lay beneath them, his body enclosed in a wooden coffin that has survived 500 years of wars, revolutions, and iconoclasm. The funeral was attended by over 2,000 mourners, including princes, scholars, and common peasants who came to pay their respects to the reformer, who had split Christianity forever. The Protestant movement that Luther began had grown to over 100 million believers worldwide by the 21st century, distributed across over 40,000 denominations and traditions. The Lutheran Church alone claimed over 80 million members, with the largest concentrations in Germany, Scandinavia, and the United States. The Reformed tradition, following Calvin's theology, included over 100 million members in Presbyterian, Congregational, and Reformed churches across Europe, Africa, and the Americas. The Baptist tradition, emerging from English separatism in 1609, grew to over 170 million members globally. The Methodist movement, founded by John Wesley in 1730, claimed over 80 million members. The Pentecostal movement, beginning in 1900, expanded to over 500 million believers by 2020. The economic impact of Protestantism on modern capitalism was profound and well documented. Max Weber, the German sociologist, published The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism in 1900 and extra, arguing that Protestant values of hard work, frugality, and individual responsibility created the cultural conditions for modern capitalism. The Protestant work ethic emphasized that success in business was a sign of God's blessing, encouraging accumulation of wealth reinvested in productive enterprises rather than spent on luxury or donated to the church. The Netherlands, the first Protestant nation, became the wealthiest country in Europe by 1600, with Amsterdam as the financial capital of the world. The United Kingdom, after its Protestant Reformation, led the Industrial Revolution starting in 1760, with textile factories, coal mines, and iron foundries transforming the economy. The United States, founded by Protestant colonists, became the world's largest economy by 1890, with a gross domestic product of over $200 billion. The political fragmentation caused by the Reformation led directly to the modern nation-state system. The Peace of Westphalia, signed on May 15, 1648, ending the 30 Years' War, established the principle of state sovereignty over religion. The treaty recognized over 300 independent German states, each with the right to determine its own religion and govern without external interference. The concept of sovereignty, where the state held ultimate authority within its borders, became the foundation of the modern international system. The United States Declaration of Independence, written on July 4, 1776, drew upon Protestant ideas of individual conscience and resistance to tyrannical authority. The French Revolution, beginning on July 14, 1789, was influenced by Protestant concepts of equality before God and the rejection of hierarchical authority. The religious wars that followed the Reformation claimed over 8 million lives in the 30 Years' War alone, devastating over 60% of German territories. The war began on May 23, 1618, with the defenestration of Prague, when Protestant nobles threw 2 Catholic governors out of a window of Prague Castle. The conflict expanded to involve over 20 European powers, with armies of over 100,000 soldiers burning crops, slaughtering livestock, and spreading plague. The city of Magdeburg was sacked on May 10, 1631, when imperial forces killed over 20,000 civilians and burned the city to the ground. The population of Germany fell from 16 million in 1600 to 12 million in 1650, a loss of 25% that took over 100 years to recover. The financial cost of the 30 Years' War was over 100 million florins in property damage, military expenditures, and lost tax revenues. The Swedish war effort cost over 10 million florins annually, funded by French subsidies of 2 million florins per year, and the looting of German territories. The Imperial Army cost over 8 million florins annually, funded by forced contributions from conquered territories and the sale of nobility titles. The war bankrupted the Habsburg monarchy, forcing Emperor Ferdinand II to sell over 1,000 estates to pay veterans and creditors. The economic devastation lasted for over 200 years, with German per capita income not recovering to pre-war levels until 1850. The splitting of Christianity created the religious pluralism that characterizes the modern world. In 1500, Europe was religiously unified under the Catholic Church, with only small Jewish and Muslim communities existing as tolerated minorities. By 2020, the world contained over 2 billion Christians divided into Catholic, Protestant, Orthodox, and other traditions, with over 40,000 Protestant denominations alone. The United States, with over 230 million Christians representing over 900 denominations, demonstrated the maximum expression of religious pluralism enabled by the Reformation. The freedom of religion, first established in the Peace of Augsburg in 1555, became a fundamental human right declared in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights on December 10, 1948. Today, the Castle Church in Wittenberg still stands, its red brick facade restored after damage from World War II bombing on December 16, 1944. The bronze doors that replaced the original oak damaged by fire in 1689 bear Luther's 95 Theses inscribed in Latin, visited by over 100,000 pilgrims annually. The hammer that nailed the original theses is preserved in the Wittenberg Museum. Its iron head rusted but still recognizable as the tool that changed history. The university where Luther taught, founded by Frederick the Wise in 1502, continues to operate with over 5,000 students. Its buildings housing the memories of the reformer who studied, taught, and preached within its walls. The schism that began with one letter, one document, one hammer strike on October 31st, 1517, created the modern world in ways that extend far beyond religion. The division of Christendom enabled the rise of nation-states, the development of capitalism, the concept of individual conscience, and the principle of religious freedom. The 300,000 deaths in the first 25 years of religious war, the 8 million deaths in the 30 Years' War, and the countless other casualties of conflicts stemming from the Reformation were the price paid for the modern world. The unity that had existed for over 1,000 years was shattered forever, replaced by a pluralism that would eventually embrace not just different Christian traditions, but different religions, different philosophies, and different ways of understanding reality itself.